They warned me the museum wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Every night, the whispers grow louder, the shadows stretch longer, and the rules are the only thing keeping me breathing. But rules were made to be broken, and now something ancient has noticed me. Do you dare step inside the Haunted Museum of Nevada? Welcome back to Dr. Snooze, where the night is never silent and the shadows always have a story. If you're new here, I invite you to join our growing family by hitting like, share, and of course subscribe so you never miss the chills that await in the dark. To all my regular viewers, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support, your comments, and your love keep this channel alive, just like the stories that keep us awake at night. Now, settle in, because tonight's tale is one you won't forget. When I first walked into the Nevada State Museum after midnight, I didn't know what I was signing up for. At 23 years old, I was desperate for money, and desperate men don't ask too many questions. A museum wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to be haunted. It was supposed to be quiet, a place where school kids came during the day and retirees wandered through on slow afternoons. But at night, the silence had a weight to it. The exhibits seemed to breathe, and the shadows stretched in ways I couldn't explain. The job was simple, or so they said. Watch the museum during the night shift. Walk the halls once every hour. Report anything suspicious to the supervisor in the morning. But when I was given the rules, the actual written rules, I realized simple was not the right word. There was a typed sheet of paper in the break room, pinned to the bulletin board with a single tack. At first, I thought it was a joke. The list looked like something ripped out of a campfire ghost story, but my supervisor, a quiet, hollow-eyed man named Mr. Lane, made it clear these rules were not a joke. I remember his voice, flat, deliberate, almost mechanical, when he said, "Follow them, and you'll make it to morning. Ignore them, and you'll regret it." I read the rules that night, my hand trembling a little as I traced down the page. 1. Begin rounds at exactly 1 a.m., no earlier, no later. 2. If you pass the Egyptian exhibit and hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Keep walking. 3. The mannequin in the Victorian hall sometimes changes position. Do not acknowledge it. Do not look directly at it for more than 3 seconds. 4. At 2:30 a.m., return to the break room. Someone will knock on the door. Do not open it. Wait until the knocking stops. 5. If you see a woman in white in the native artifacts section, avoid her. Never answer if she speaks your name. 6. By 4 a.m., all clocks in the building will stop. Ignore the silence and continue rounds. They will start again at 5. 7. At 5:45 a.m., you must sit at the reception desk. Do not move until staff arrive at 6. I stared at the list, my throat dry. My first thought was that someone was playing a cruel joke, but the way Mr. Lane stood, stiff and expectant, made me realize it wasn't a joke to him. "Do people really follow this?" I asked. He only nodded. His eyes, though, told me more than words could. The first hour passed quietly. Midnight in the museum was eerie, but manageable. The security cameras flickered occasionally, but I figured that was just old wiring. I sat at the reception desk, watching the glow of the monitors. In one, I could see the massive woolly mammoth skeleton looming over the pale floor tiles. In another, the dim-lit Victorian hall stretched into shadow, its wax figures frozen in eternal dinner parties and ballroom scenes. When the clock struck 1, I stood and began my first round. The sound of my shoes echoed against the polished floor, each step loud and lonely. The museum seemed larger at night, the rooms more cavernous, the exhibits somehow alive in their silence. I made my way through the fossil hall first, the mammoth's bones casting jagged shadows along the walls. For a moment, I could have sworn the skull tilted slightly, as if watching me. I shook the thought off and continued, my footsteps carrying me toward the Egyptian exhibit. That was when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. They were slow at first, faint but undeniably there. My whole body stiffened. I remembered rule number 2. Do not turn around. Keep walking. The footsteps grew louder, closer, matching my pace. I could feel the air change, colder, heavier, as though someone was right at my back. My instincts screamed at me to whirl around, to shine my flashlight and catch whoever was following. But I clenched my jaw and pushed forward, walking faster, heart pounding in my throat. By the time I reached the end of the Egyptian wing, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the museum itself was holding its breath. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder, even though every nerve in my body demanded it. The Victorian hall was worse. I stepped into the long gallery, lined with glass cases and dressed mannequins, each one frozen in some scene from the late 1800s. There was a man in a top hat, a woman in a lace gown, children with porcelain faces gathered around a tea set. Their eyes, painted or glass, I couldn't tell, seemed to follow me as I walked. Rule number 3 rang in my mind. The mannequin sometimes changes position. Do not acknowledge it. I didn't want to look, but I had to check. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then, halfway down the hall, I saw it. The tall figure of a butler mannequin, dressed in black with a silver tray, was no longer by the doorway where I remembered. It was now several feet closer, standing by a glass case. The tray it held was tilted, as though it had been moved mid-step. My breath caught. I looked down, fixing my gaze on the polished floor, refusing to meet its blank face. I forced myself to count each step, one after the other, until I reached the end of the hall. But I couldn't shake the sound. The faint scrape of wood on tile behind me. I didn't run. God knows I wanted to, but I walked as calmly as I could, refusing to look back. By the time I left the hall, sweat was dripping down my temples. At 2:30, I made it back to the break room. My hands trembled as I locked the door behind me and collapsed into the chair. My breath came in ragged bursts, my heart still hammering. That was when the knock came. It was soft at first, just 3 little raps. I froze, my blood running cold. Rule number 4, someone will knock. Do not open it. Wait until it stops. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I gripped the arms of the chair, staring at the door, my pulse deafening in my ears. The knocking grew harsher, faster, until it sounded like fists pounding against the wood. Then a voice. Open up. It was low, almost a whisper, but I heard it. My name. Daniel. I nearly lost it right there. Nobody knew me here. I hadn't told Mr. Lane or anyone else my name. The pounding continued, shaking the door. I shut my eyes and pressed my hands against my ears, though forcing myself to stay still. Minutes passed, long, endless minutes, until the noise finally stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I didn't dare move. When the clock on the wall ticked to 3, I finally stood and continued my rounds. My legs felt like lead, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The native artifacts section was quiet, too quiet. The display cases stood like coffins, filled with pottery, tools, and sacred garments. As I passed the far end, I caught a glimpse of her, a woman in white. She stood at the edge of the hall, half shrouded in shadow, her face pale, her hair hanging long and dark. Daniel. She spoke my name again, her voice soft, coaxing. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to answer, to step closer, but I remembered rule number 5. Never respond. I kept walking, faster now, refusing to look again. But I could feel her eyes on me, burning into the back of my skull. By the time I finished the round, my whole body was shaking. I sat at the reception desk again, staring at the clocks as they ticked closer to 4. And then, as if on cue, every clock in the museum stopped. The silence that followed was crushing. The hands froze at 4, every second hand suspended in place. The ticking was gone. The world felt wrong, empty. I sat there in the stillness, my breath the only sound in the museum, praying I could make it to 600. But somewhere in the distance, past the fossil hall, I heard it. The sound of footsteps again. This time they weren't behind me. They were ahead, and they were coming closer. The footsteps echoed through the fossil hall, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something knew I was listening. The silence of the museum was so heavy that every step reverberated like a hammer against stone. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam cutting through the dark but revealing nothing except the skeletal remains of creatures long dead. The mammoth loomed over me, its massive bones twisted in shadow, and for a moment I thought the sound was coming from beneath it. The thought alone made my stomach twist. I remembered the rules. None of them mentioned what to do about footsteps ahead of me, only footsteps behind. I had no guidance, no line to follow. Still, the sound came closer. I could see nothing, not a soul in the hall, yet the footsteps grew louder, clearer, echoing off the polished floors. I froze, pressing my back against the wall, heart slamming so hard I could barely breathe. Hello? The word slipped from me before I could stop it. A mistake. A big one. The footsteps stopped instantly, as though they had been waiting for me to acknowledge them. The silence that followed wasn't just empty. It was suffocating, as if the museum itself was holding me hostage in its stillness. Then, very faintly, I heard breathing. It wasn't mine. It was deep, ragged, and close, closer than I could bear to think. I swept the flashlight beam across the hall, catching only bones, shadows, and empty floor. The breathing stopped. I couldn't stand still any longer. I pushed forward, walking quickly, my shoes clacking loudly, almost as though I was trying to drown out the silence myself. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, and I swear I felt something brush against the back of my neck as I hurried through the last stretch of the fossil hall. By the time I reached the next corridor, I was sweating through my shirt. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the flashlight. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to steady my breath, but the uneasy silence lingered like a presence behind me. The hours crawled on. Each round of the museum felt longer, darker, heavier. Every step seemed to draw the walls closer, and every shadow seemed to lean in. I tried to remind myself that it was just a job, that I was earning money, that all I had to do was make it to morning. But the rules, those cursed rules, were beginning to feel less like precautions and more like a death sentence waiting for me to make a mistake. At 2:30, when the knocking had come, I'd held firm. But now, at 4, with the clocks frozen, I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The silence after the clock stopped was unlike anything I had ever experienced. No ticking, no humming lights, no distant cars outside. Just nothing. The world had gone still, as if time itself had abandoned the museum. I sat at the reception desk, staring at the wall clock, its second hand suspended between numbers, never moving. My chest tightened as the silence pressed against my ears, and I realized I was holding my breath without knowing it. Then, faintly, from deep inside the museum, came a different sound. A child's laugh. It was soft, high-pitched, and carried through the stillness like a knife. I nearly fell out of my chair. There were no children here. Not at this hour. Not ever. The laugh came again, closer this time, echoing through the empty halls. I gripped the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind screaming at me not to leave the desk. But curiosity, or maybe terror, drove me to stand. I followed the sound. The laugh echoed through the Victorian hall, bouncing between the wax figures. The mannequins stood silently, their glassy eyes reflecting the dim glow of my flashlight. They seemed closer together now, as though they had shifted subtly while I wasn't looking. Halfway down the hall, I heard the laugh again, this time from behind a figure in a white lace gown. My breath hitched. The mannequin seemed taller than before, its head tilted slightly, as though listening. "Hello?" I whispered before I could stop myself. The laugh stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Then, slowly, the mannequin's head turned. The cracking sound of stiff joints breaking the silence made bile rise in my throat. Its painted face shifted just enough that its empty eyes stared directly into mine. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight flickered, as though something unseen had drained the power. I forced myself to keep moving, running now through the hall and out the other side. I didn't dare look back, but the sound of scraping wood followed me, slow, steady steps that didn't belong to me. By the time I reached the native artifacts section again, I was gasping for air. The rows of cases gleamed faintly under the weak emergency lights. I had almost convinced myself I was safe, that I had outrun whatever was following me. Then I saw her again, the woman in white. She stood at the far end of the hall, her long dress brushing against the floor. Her hair was dark and tangled, her face pale and distant. This time she was closer. "Daniel." She said my name in that same soft, coaxing tone. But this time it was sharper, more demanding. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. I remembered the rule: never respond. I turned away, walking as fast as I could, refusing to look back. But the sound of fabric dragging against the floor followed me, a faint whisper in the silence. I reached the reception desk again, collapsing into the chair. My whole body trembled as I stared at the frozen clock. I prayed for time to move, for anything to break the silence. Then suddenly the lights flickered. All at once the ticking returned. The clocks resumed, their hands jerking forward as if nothing had happened. The sound of time rushing back into the building was almost deafening. It was 5. I felt tears prick my eyes. Somehow I had made it. Just one more hour, one more. But I didn't feel safe. Not at all. The museum had grown hungrier during that frozen hour, and I could feel its gaze pressing down on me, waiting for me to slip. At 5:45, I did as the rules said. I sat at the reception desk, hands clasped, body rigid. Do not move until staff arrive at 6. The minutes stretched painfully, but I didn't dare get up. Every shadow in the room seemed deeper, every creak of the building louder. I sat frozen, terrified that if I so much as scratched my nose, something would notice. Then I saw movement on the monitor screens. The cameras showed the exhibits, each one flickering slightly. In the Victorian hall, the mannequins were gone, every single one of them. In the Egyptian exhibit, the empty stone sarcophagus was now closed. And in the native artifacts wing, the woman in white was no longer at the far end. She was standing directly in front of the camera, staring into it as though she could see me. The monitor flickered, and for a split second, I swear her face shifted into a twisted grin. When the staff arrived at 6, the spell broke. The museum came alive again, lights brightening, the weight of the night lifting. Mr. Lane walked in first, his expression unreadable, as though he knew exactly what I had endured. "You followed the rules?" he asked simply. I nodded, though my voice was too weak to answer. "Good," he said. "You'll be back tomorrow night." I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to quit, walk out the door, and never step foot inside the museum again. But the words caught in my throat. My rent was due, my wallet nearly empty, and this was the only job I had managed to find. So I said nothing. I told myself the first night had been the worst, that it couldn't get any worse. But I was wrong. The second night was waiting for me, and the museum was ready. When the sun set on the second day, dread sat heavy in my stomach. The thought of going back into that museum twisted me inside out. I had spent the whole day trying to convince myself that it hadn't been real, that maybe exhaustion, stress, or an overactive imagination had warped what I'd seen. But when I closed my eyes to sleep, I kept hearing the woman's voice whispering my name, kept seeing the mannequin's head creak slowly toward me. By the time evening rolled around, my hands shook as I buttoned my uniform. The walk to the museum felt shorter, as though my feet carried me on autopilot. When I arrived, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the building loomed against the dusky sky like some ancient tomb. Mr. Lane was waiting in the reception area, his pale face unreadable. He studied me for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You made it through the first night," he said finally. "Barely," I muttered, though I doubted he cared. He handed me a folded slip of paper. I frowned, unfolding it. The rules were the same, but a new one had been added. 8. If you hear music coming from the Victorian hall after 3 a.m., do not enter. I looked up at him, but he was already turning away, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. "What happens if I go in?" I asked. He stopped, his back to me, shoulders stiff. "You won't come out," he said simply, and then left without another word. I sat at the reception desk, staring at the paper until midnight arrived. The museum was too quiet, as though it knew I was back. My skin prickled with unease. When the clock struck 1, I stood, my legs weak beneath me, and began my first round. The fossil hall greeted me with silence. The mammoth skeleton towered above, its hollow eye sockets watching as I passed beneath. I moved quickly, refusing to linger. In the Egyptian exhibit, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though the stone walls themselves were breathing. My footsteps echoed too loudly. That was when I heard them again, footsteps behind me. I clenched my teeth and kept walking, my pace steady though my heart thundered. The sound mirrored me perfectly, as though someone's shoes were glued to mine, step for step. Cold air brushed against my ear, carrying the faintest whisper. I nearly cracked, nearly turned around, but I forced myself forward, my eyes locked on the doorway at the far end. When I crossed it, the footsteps stopped, leaving only silence. By the time I reached the Victorian hall, I could already feel my nerves fraying. The mannequins stood in their frozen party scenes, their glassy eyes catching the dim light. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The butler mannequin was gone. I swallowed hard and kept moving, refusing to linger. The scrape of wood on tile followed me again, faint but steady. I counted each step under my breath until I reached the end of the hall. At 2:30, I locked myself in the break room, dreading the knock. It came, right on time. 3 raps, soft at first, then louder, heavier, pounding against the door. Daniel, my blood froze. It was the same voice as before, coaxing, demanding. Let me in. I pressed my back against the chair, hands over my ears, refusing to move. The pounding grew violent, shaking the door on its hinges. Then the voice shifted. It wasn't coaxing anymore. It was angry. Daniel. The way it snarled my name made bile rise in my throat. The knocking went on for what felt like hours, until suddenly silence crashed over the room. I stayed frozen, every muscle aching, until the wall clock ticked to 3. I rose, legs trembling, and stepped back into the museum. That was when I heard it. Music. Soft at first, like an old gramophone turning somewhere deep in the Victorian hall. A waltz, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the air. Rule number 8. Do not enter. I froze in the corridor, every nerve screaming at me to stay away. But the music grew louder, drifting toward me as though the walls themselves carried it. My hand twitched on the flashlight, my body torn between curiosity and fear. I forced myself to turn away, heading instead toward the native artifacts section. The music followed, faintly echoing through the halls until it seemed to seep into my bones. That was when I saw her again, the woman in white. She stood at the far end of the hall, closer than before. Her head was tilted slightly, her eyes hollow, her dress glowing faintly in the dim light. Daniel, she whispered, her voice soft but sharp enough to pierce the air. My throat tightened, my legs locking. I wanted to run, but her eyes pinned me in place like a predator cornering its prey. Come closer. Her voice was sweeter now, almost pleading. I forced myself to look down, to walk faster, ignoring her completely. But then I heard something that nearly broke me. Her voice changed. It was my mother's voice. Daniel, she said softly, exactly the way she used to when waking me for school. Please don't leave me. Tears stung my eyes. I bit down hard on my tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself forward, refusing to answer. By the time I reached the reception desk, I was shaking so badly I nearly collapsed. The music had faded, but the echo of my mother's voice clung to me like a sickness. At 4, the clock stopped again. This time I braced myself. The silence that followed was suffocating, thicker than the night before. I sat rigid in the chair, staring at the frozen hands, waiting for whatever came next. The child's laugh returned, but it wasn't alone this time. I heard multiple voices, children giggling, whispering, running through the halls. The sound of tiny feet pattered against the tile floors, circling me, though I saw nothing. Then, faintly, one of the monitors flickered. The camera feed of the Victorian hall lit up. The mannequins were moving, not in jerks, not in flickers. They were dancing. The children's laughter grew louder as I watched the wax figures twirl slowly, their stiff arms wrapped around each other in an awkward waltz. Their heads lolled, their eyes lifeless, but still they moved in rhythm with the faint music I had heard earlier. I gripped the edge of the desk, bile rising in my throat. One of the mannequins, the butler, turned directly toward the camera. His face was blank, his painted eyes glassy, but his mouth moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read his lips. He mouthed my name. I shut my eyes, praying for the silence to end. When the clocks resumed at 5, the dancing stopped. The monitors flickered back to stillness, the mannequins frozen once again. The laughter ceased, replaced by the ticking of time returning. I sat there, trembling, my nails digging into the desk until they nearly broke. At 5:45, I forced myself to follow the rule. Sit at the reception desk, do not move. But something was different this time. The lights dimmed, flickering faintly, as though the building itself was testing me. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of dust and rot. My eyes burned from trying not to blink. Then on the monitor, I saw her, the woman in white. She was no longer in the native artifacts wing. She was standing in the reception hall, just outside the glow of my desk lamp. I didn't dare turn my head to check, but in the monitor, I saw her take one slow step closer. The clock ticked towards 6, every second stretched into eternity. The woman stepped closer. My breath came in short gasps. I sat frozen, every muscle screaming to run, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The second hand crept forward. 5:59. The woman was only a few feet away now, her face obscured, her hair hanging in dark strands. The clock struck 6. The lights flared back to life. The woman vanished. Mr. Lane entered moments later, his face unreadable as always. "You followed the new rule," he said. I nodded weakly. He studied me, his eyes hollow. "Good. Tomorrow there may be more." I wanted to quit. God knows I wanted to. But the paycheck was already in my pocket, and my empty apartment waited for me. So I stayed quiet. But deep down I knew the museum was getting stronger, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. The third night at the museum felt different before it even began. I arrived early, hoping to steal a few minutes of calm before the rules took hold. But the building seemed to sense me the moment I stepped inside. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. Even the reception desk felt colder under my hands. Mr. Lane was waiting for me again. He looked worse than before. His eyes bloodshot, his skin almost gray. I wondered if he ever slept, or if this job had drained every ounce of life from him. Without speaking, he handed me another slip of paper. My stomach dropped when I unfolded it. There was another new rule, 9. If the mannequins smile at you, smile back. Do not look away until they stop. I stared at it for a long moment, my pulse thundering. When I looked up, Mr. Lane was gone, as though he had vanished into the walls. Midnight passed like a slow funeral march. I sat at the reception desk, staring at the monitors, dreading the rounds to come. Every minute felt heavier, like the museum was watching me, waiting for me to slip. At 1, I stood and began walking. My legs felt like lead, every step dragging me deeper into the nightmare. The fossil hall was quiet, too quiet. I walked quickly, refusing to linger under the mammoth shadow. The Egyptian exhibit, however, was worse than ever. The air pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. The footsteps came again, behind me, close, perfectly in sync with my own. My breath grew shallow. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I forced myself forward. The footsteps stopped the instant I crossed the threshold into the Victorian hall. The mannequins were waiting. They stood frozen in their familiar scenes, but something about them felt different. Their faces seemed sharper, their glassy eyes brighter. I could almost swear they were watching me. I walked carefully, my flashlight beam bouncing across their still forms. My chest tightened as I noticed the butler again. He wasn't where he had been last night. Now, he stood in the middle of the hall, directly in my path, his tray tilted slightly as though in offering. I forced myself to keep walking, careful not to acknowledge him. My shoes clicked softly against the tile. The silence pressed against me until I thought my ears would burst. Then I saw it, the woman in the lace gown. Her lips were curved into a faint smile. My heart dropped into my stomach. I remembered the new rule. If the mannequins smile at you, smile back. My face felt stiff as I forced my mouth into a shaky grin. My cheeks trembled, my eyes burning. I stood there, smiling like a lunatic at a mannequin in a dusty hall, praying it would stop. The smile on her painted face seemed to stretch, just slightly. My stomach churned. I held my grin, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. Finally, after what felt like hours, her lips softened, returning to their frozen neutrality. I dropped my smile instantly, nearly choking on the sob that escaped me. My legs nearly gave out as I stumbled past her, refusing to look at any of the others. At 2:30, I locked myself in the break room, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the key. The knock came right on time, soft at first, then louder, then violent. "Daniel." The voice was sharper tonight, almost mocking. "Daniel, open the door. It's safe now." I pressed my back to the wall, my breath ragged. Then I heard something new. The sound of scratching. Something sharp dragged across the wood of the door, over and over again, as though clawing to get in. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. The scratching grew faster, louder, until it sounded like nails raking through the wood itself. Then silence. I didn't move until the clock ticked to 3. When I stepped back into the museum, the air was colder and the faint sound of music drifted from the Victorian hall again. I froze, remembering rule number 8. Do not enter if you hear music. But as I turned to walk the other way, something caught my eye. The butler mannequin. He stood at the far end of the hall, just visible in the shadows, his tray extended toward me. His face was still expressionless, but I could almost feel him waiting. I turned away, forcing myself down another corridor. But as I walked, I caught a reflection in the glass cases. The butler was closer now. My chest tightened. I walked faster, refusing to look directly, but the reflections followed. His black suit, his pale hands, his tray, closer every time I blinked. By the time I reached the native artifacts section, I was nearly running. And there she was, the woman in white. She stood just a few feet away this time, her hair hanging like a veil, her pale face half hidden. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice sharp enough to cut. I kept walking, faster, but she followed. The sound of fabric dragging against the floor was right behind me, close enough that I could almost feel her breath. I reached the reception desk, gasping for air, and collapsed into the chair. My hands shook violently as I clung to the desk, praying for the clocks to hold steady. But at 4, they stopped again. The silence returned, and with it came something new. Not laughter this time, not whispers, but singing. A low, haunting hum drifted through the halls, winding around me like smoke. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered together in a terrible harmony. The sound was beautiful, horrifying at the same time, a melody that made my skin crawl. I glanced at the monitors, my breath catching in my throat. In the Victorian hall, the mannequins were moving again. Not just dancing this time, they were smiling, all of them. Dozens of painted faces twisted into wide, unnatural grins, their glassy eyes glinting under the dim light. Their stiff bodies jerked and twirled, their mouths stretching too far, teeth painted bright and cruel. On the screen, they all turned in unison. They were facing the camera, facing me. I couldn't breathe. My face twitched, my body screaming not to do it, but I forced myself to smile back at the monitor, my lips trembling as I grinned at those terrible faces. The mannequins froze, their smiles holding. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my chest. Then, one by one, their smiles faded, their bodies stilled. The humming stopped. The clocks resumed at 5. I collapsed forward, gasping, sweat pouring down my face. My cheeks ached from holding the grin. At 5:45, I sat rigid at the reception desk, terrified of what the last minutes would bring. The monitors flickered again, and my blood ran cold. The woman in white stood behind the reception desk. Not in the hall, not in the cameras, behind me. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. The clock ticked slowly, each second an eternity. 5:59. The air behind me was cold, suffocating. I could feel her presence, her breath brushing against my neck. The clock struck 6 run. The weight lifted instantly. The lights flared back to life. I turned around. She was gone. Mr. Lane entered as usual, his expression flat, though I could see something different in his eyes this time, something like pity. "You smiled," he said. I nodded weakly, too drained to speak. He stared at me for a long moment before saying, "Not everyone can." He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "the museum may ask more of you." And then he was gone, leaving me in the cold light of morning, wondering just how much more the museum wanted. I felt like a soldier reporting to the front lines of a battle I never enlisted for. My head was foggy from lack of sleep, and my body still trembled from the whispers I'd heard the night before. But something compelled me to go back. Maybe it was fear of losing the job, or maybe it was the strange pull the museum had on me. The night guard's desk felt colder than usual. The rule book lay there, waiting, like an executioner's blade. I flipped it open, trying to convince myself that following the rules was the only way to survive. But then I noticed something. A page had been torn out. I froze. The rules had been my lifeline, the only thing keeping me tethered to some kind of safety. Now one was missing. I flipped through again, hoping I had imagined it. No, the tear was jagged, raw, as if someone or something didn't want me to know what was written there. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering, but no one was there. The hall stretched out, empty, yet the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the east wing, the one closed off for renovations. I remembered the note scrawled in the back of the book: "Do not enter the east wing after midnight." I should have stayed at the desk, but curiosity dug its claws into me. I picked up my flashlight and walked down the long hall. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, until it felt like my breath was crystallizing in front of me. At the end of the corridor stood a door I had never noticed before. It was carved from dark wood, the kind that looked older than the building itself. My fingers hesitated on the handle, but the door creaked open on its own, beckoning me. Inside, the wing didn't look like part of the museum. It was something else entirely. The walls seemed narrower, warped, almost breathing. The exhibits here were stranger, too. Mannequins dressed in old military uniforms, eyes painted too vividly. Dolls lined in glass cases, their heads tilted at odd angles, smiles too wide. And then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The placards next to the displays didn't describe artifacts. They described people. Names, dates of birth, dates of death. Each one sounded like an actual person, as if the mannequins weren't mannequins at all. My flashlight flickered. When it came back on, one of the mannequins had moved. Its arm, once at its side, was now pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, but the others began to shift too. Slow, almost unnoticeable when I looked directly at them, but in the corners of my vision, they crept closer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The air grew thick, suffocating, as whispers surrounded me. They weren't the same as before. These weren't warning me. They were chanting my name, over and over. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. The hallway had vanished, replaced by more mannequins, stretching endlessly in both directions. I was trapped. I ran, my footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. No matter how far I went, the wings stretched on. The mannequins seemed to multiply, their faces warping into grotesque smiles. My flashlight sputtered and died. Darkness swallowed me whole. And then silence. I stood still, not daring to breathe until a cold hand brushed against my neck. I spun around, swinging blindly, but the touch lingered, icy fingers wrapping around my throat. My chest tightened as if the air was being pulled from my lungs. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the grip released. My flashlight flickered back on, and the mannequins were gone. The wing was empty, the door behind me open again. I stumbled out, gasping for air, collapsing at the guard's desk. The missing page from the rulebook lay there now, as if it had never been gone. My trembling fingers lifted it, and the rule was simple. If you enter the East Wing after midnight, you will become part of the collection. I dropped the page, bile rising in my throat. They wanted me. They almost had me, but the night wasn't over yet. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold marble floor of the museum's grand hall. My head throbbed, my body ached, and for a brief moment I thought everything had been a dream. But the silence that hung in the air was not the silence of safety. It was heavy, suffocating, and alive. The faint hum of the exhibits around me carried a pulse, as though the walls themselves had a heartbeat. I sat up slowly, clutching my ribs. My flashlight was gone, and the only source of light was the faint glow of the moon filtering through the massive glass dome above. I remembered running. I remembered the shadows, the voices, and that grotesque reflection of myself trying to pull me into the glass. But most of all, I remembered the last rule, Rule 7. Never acknowledge the man with no face, and I had seen him. I didn't want to think about what that meant for me. Forcing myself to my feet, I staggered toward the security office. Maybe, just maybe, I could radio for help. Maybe I could explain that I had been injured, that there had been a break-in, or anything that didn't involve mentioning what I had actually seen. Because no one would believe me. Not the police, not the staff, no one. But when I opened the door to the office, the room wasn't how I'd left it. The desk was overturned. The monitors were shattered, black screens reflecting the broken image of my face. And in the center of the room sat the ledger, the one I had signed at the beginning of my first night. The book was open, pages fluttering although there was no breeze. I approached it cautiously, dread coiling in my stomach. My name was there, written in thick, inky strokes. But now, under it, new lines had appeared, sentences in a language I couldn't read, curling letters like the claws of some beast. The ink pulsed as though alive. I tried to slam it shut, but the book resisted, as though some invisible force held it open. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Not shuffling like the spirits I'd encountered before, not light like a guard. These steps were filled with weight, intention, and dread. I froze. The figure appeared in the doorway, tall and slim, its face nothing more than a pale oval of stretched skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, blank flesh where its features should have been. The man with no face. I couldn't move, my legs locked in place as though invisible chains bound me. He stepped into the room, and though he had no eyes, I felt him looking at me, staring directly into my soul. My throat tightened. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. He lifted his hand and pointed toward the ledger. The message was clear. He wanted me to keep reading. Every fiber of my being screamed not to, but my hands moved on their own, trembling, flipping the pages faster and faster. The words blurred into pictures, grotesque images of people screaming, faces melting, bodies twisted into impossible shapes. And then I saw something that nearly made me collapse. It was me. There, in vivid detail, was a drawing of me sitting in that exact chair in the office, eyes hollow, face blank, identical to his. I stumbled backward, knocking into the wall. "No," I whispered, though no sound escaped. "That's not me. That's not me." The faceless man tilted his head as if amused, as if mocking me. And then he took a step closer. I bolted. Bursting out of the office, I ran down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. The museum stretched endlessly, corridors twisting into new shapes, doors leading to places I had never seen before. Every time I thought I recognized an exhibit, it shifted, warped into something unfamiliar. It was as if the entire museum had turned against me. I stumbled into the ancient Egypt wing, statues looming overhead, their stone eyes watching me. The sarcophagus in the center creaked open on its own, dust spilling out. A skeletal hand reached for me, but I didn't stop running. Through the medieval gallery, suits of armor clanged and groaned, helmets turning to follow me as I passed. One lifted its sword, and for a moment I thought it would strike me down, but it stayed frozen, waiting as if I was no longer its target, because he was coming. No matter how fast I ran, I could hear his footsteps, always steady, always closer. Finally, I burst into the grand hall again, collapsing to my knees. My chest burned, my throat raw, but when I looked up, I wasn't alone. The statues that lined the walls, the marble figures of saints, gods, and heroes were gone. In their place stood dozens of faceless figures, identical to the man who pursued me. Their smooth, pale heads turned in unison, focusing on me. I was surrounded. I pressed my back against the cold floor, shaking. "Please," I whispered. "I didn't break the rules. I tried." The man with no face stepped forward from the crowd. He raised his hand again, and the ledger appeared in front of me, floating in the air. It slammed open to the final page, blank. And then a quill appeared, dripping with black ink that hissed as it touched the air. The message was clear. I had to sign, but I knew deep down that if I did, it would mean the end of me. I wouldn't just be working night shift here anymore. I would become part of it, a permanent exhibit, a faceless figure doomed to haunt these halls forever. My hands shook violently as the quill lowered toward me. My name burned in my mind. I wanted to scream, to fight, to refuse, but the weight of all those faceless stares pressed down on me. I grabbed the quill, and at that exact moment the museum's bells chimed. 3 o'clock. The figures froze. The faceless man turned his head toward the sound, body trembling as though in pain. The air crackled. For the first time I saw him falter. I didn't waste the chance. Dropping the quill, I bolted for the exit. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, through the hall, past the statues, past the exhibits. The doors groaned, resisting as I shoved them, but finally they gave way. I stumbled out into the cold night air. The city lights of Nevada shimmered in the distance. The sky was still dark, but it felt alive again, real, unlike the suffocating void inside. I fell to my knees, gasping, clutching the ground as if it might disappear beneath me. When I turned back, the museum doors were shut, silent, as if they had never opened. But even as relief flooded me, I knew it wasn't over, because the rules still existed. The ledger still bore my name, and the faceless man had seen me. I don't know if I'll ever escape him. I don't know if leaving the museum was truly leaving at all, or if I've only carried its curse with me. But one thing is certain. If you ever find yourself working night shift at the Nevada Museum, remember the rules. Follow them exactly. Don't break a single one. And if you see the man with no face, don't look at him. Don't speak to him. Don't even think about him. Because once he knows you, he never lets you go. And that, my dear night owls, brings us to the end of tonight's chilling story. If you enjoyed wandering through the shadows with me, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the lanterns burning in the dark corners of Dr. Snooze. Thank you for staying up with me when the rest of the world sleeps. Until the next story, keep your eyes open, because the night always has secrets to whisper. Good night, my night owls. Sleep if you can.